Broad Marsh. The name echoes through time. Now ascribed to a shopping centre, it appears in town records from as far back as 1370, in the Latin form Magnus Mariscus.
Magnus Mariscus.
Though the name could be far older. With all those centuries of history, there must have been a dark time. A terrible secret, hidden by concrete. A time that the city has tried to forget. In 1750, Nottingham was a garden town of around 11,000 people in 2,300 houses. The town was famous for its greenery, cleanliness, and open spaces. Broad Marsh was an area of marshland on the town's edge, home to a small mix of workers, tradesmen, and aristocrats. But all of that was about to change. But to understand what happened after 1750, we need a bit of context first. Chapter 1. Hosiery. Nottingham's textiles industry goes back hundreds of years, possibly more than 1,000. The Nottingham Guild of Weavers received a charter in 1199, and by the 1300s, the price for Nottingham wool was the standard for all of England. There were spinners who made yarn, weavers who wove cloth, litsters who dyed cloth, and knitters who made hosiery. In 1589, the stocking frame, the first mechanical knitting machine, was invented by William Lee in the village of Calverton, 7 miles northeast of Nottingham. According to legend, he invented the stocking frame out of frustration. A woman he was flirting with was ignoring his advances and focusing on her knitting. Imagine if he'd thought, maybe it's not knitting that's the problem. Maybe it's me. Machines were too expensive for the average worker to buy, so employers bought them and rented them to knitters who wanted to increase their productivity. A hand knitter could not compete against a framework knitter, and it wasn't too difficult to learn how to use a stocking frame. Children could do it, to give their parents a rest while maintaining productivity. By 1750, there were about 1,200 frames at work in Nottingham, and hosiery was the town's main industry. It was a cottage industry. The work was carried out in workers' homes. Chapter 2. Rise of the Machines. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, which doubled the productivity of weavers. It was widely in use by the 1750s, forcing many weavers to find a new job. In hosiery or spinning, for instance. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a device which enabled a spinner to make 8 threads at once instead of 1. He'd started a business in Blackburn, but when his machines caused the price of yarn to drop, the local spinners became enraged and trashed his house and machines. So he fled to Nottingham in 1768 and set up a mill in Hockley, where he was successful. And in 1768, a team of craftsmen employed by Richard Arkwright invented the spinning frame, which produced better quality yarn than the spinning jenny. He set up his first factory, horse-powered, in Nottingham, before partnering with some wealthy hosieries and moving production to the Cromford Mill in Derbyshire, the world's first water-powered cotton mill. Water-powered frames could spin 128 threads at once, and were super easy to use. Children, some as young as 7, made up about 2/3 of Arkwright's workforce. Arkwright is remembered as the father of the modern-day factory system, and at his death in 1792 was reputedly the richest non-aristocrat in Britain. Nottingham has a street named after him. Smaller-scale cotton spinning couldn't compete against the mass-produced threads. So a lot of spinners became unemployed and looked for work elsewhere. In hosiery, for instance. Chapter 3. The Army of the Unemployed. For centuries before 1750, the population of England had been growing as the country recovered from the Black Death, and agriculture was changing. New techniques improved productivity, so the country could sustain a larger population than ever before. Part of this second agricultural revolution was the enclosure of common lands. Common land was land which, regardless of who owned it, other people, commoners, had rights to use. However, it didn't mean the land could be used by anyone for anything, nor for free. Some families had the right to pasture cows on common land. Others were allocated a strip of common land to grow crops on. The rights to use the land were inherited, and if a family died out, the rights were reallocated by lot to people with no commons rights. Commons rights also came with commons responsibilities. Commoners had to work together to maintain the land, and also had to pay rent to the landlord or work on other land he owned. Commons rights prevented new settlers in the village from setting up their own farm on land that had been used by another family for centuries, protected the tenant commoners from being evicted or replaced by the landlord, prevented commoners from moving away or changing jobs, prevented the landlord from using the land for anything that would interfere with the commons rights. This system made agriculture more cooperative and communal. There were no fences or walls separating one person's land from another's. The English countryside was open all the way to the horizon. Enclosure was the process by which common land was converted to the private land we know today. Commons rights and responsibilities were declared void for all time. The commons rights
fell into the time field. The
commons right
in your memory never existed.
The land became the exclusive private property of the landlord. The fields of the countryside were divided by fences, walls, ditches and hedges, becoming the patchwork we recognise to this day. Commoners were paid a small compensation by the landlord for the loss of their rights, so you can think of it as the landlords buying all the rights to the land and consolidating them into the single concept of private ownership. With exclusive private ownership, landlords were free to do as they pleased with the land, often converting it from the small strip farms into larger, more productive farms which required fewer tenants and labourers, or they turned it into exclusive parkland for their country estate. Across the country, common land had gradually been enclosed since the 13th century through private agreements between landlords and commoners. But from 1604, Parliament got involved, using enclosure acts to force enclosure when the commoners wouldn't agree to it. The rate of enclosure accelerated, peaking between 1750 and 1850. So, as the population increased, the availability of agricultural work decreased. Once the short post-enclosure boom in the fencing, wall-making and ditch-digging industries died off, former farmers and labourers were unemployed and moved away from the villages their families had lived in for generations and marched to towns and cities in search of work. Sometimes entire villages were abandoned. One of the towns they went to was Nottingham. Chapter 4. Growing Pains. The population of Nottingham grew rapidly after 1750. To 18,000 in the 1780s, 25,000 in the 1790s, more than doubling in less than 50 years. The gardens, pastures and orchards that had made Nottingham such a pleasant town in 1750 were built over with houses. The gentry moved away, converting their fancy houses to flats, or demolishing and replacing them with back-to-back houses to rent to the new arrivals. Typically, the houses built for the new workers were 3 floors with a room on each floor and storage space under the stairs, living space, bedroom and workshop, where the stocking frame was kept. These houses were built quickly and with little organisation, turning the town into a maze of alleys, lanes and courts. The wages of the knitters plummeted as rural migrants and out-of-work weavers and spinners joined the industry. What's more, food prices were increasing with demand. The population was greater, and labourers who had once subsisted off common land now had to buy their food, were now customers. And in 1793, Britain joined the other European monarchies in the wars against post-revolutionary France, causing further price increases as food was redirected towards the war effort.
I'll take you all on!
Prices continued to rise after the wars because the government imposed tariffs on imported food to protect the profits of agricultural landlords. The phrase, "as poor as a stockinger," became common, and so did rioting. Troops were stationed in Nottingham, ostensibly to defend the town against a possible French invasion, but mainly to quell riots. Chapter 5. The Vanishing River. As British industry grew, it encouraged investment in better transport. The Nottingham Canal was built in the 1790s, during Canal Mania. It was decided that the best course for the canal was the route of the River Leen, so most of the river's waters were diverted, and the canal built in its place. A smaller River Leen ran through the town, partially exposed, partially underground, for decades, until it was covered by the end of the 19th century, because it had become a sewer. Today, you can see a bit of the old River Leen, known as Tinker's Leen, running along the canal before it disappears underground. The Nottingham Canal features in the D.H. Lawrence novel Sons and Lovers. In Carrington Street, they stopped to hang over the parapet and look at the barges on the canal below.
"It's just like Venice,"
he said, seeing the sunshine on the water that lay between the high factory walls.
With the river tamed, the marshy areas of Broad Marsh and Narrow Marsh were no longer marshy. They could be built on more easily. They weren't going to flood. The value of the land shot up, and landlords built as many houses on it as they could.
As Nottingham's population continued to increase to 34,000 by 1811, 40,000 by 1821, 50,000 by 1831, the houses of Nottingham got more and more crammed together, and the former marshland became one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Chapter 6. Second only to Bombay. In less than a century, the garden town had been transformed into a warren of overcrowded slums. By the 1830s, there were about 11,000 houses in Nottingham for over 50,000 people. Of those 11,000, about 8,000 were the back-to-back slum houses. The condition of the working class in England at the time was, famously, not great, but the slums of Nottingham were worse than those of other industrial towns. Other towns increased in size as well as population, whereas Nottingham just crammed more and more people into the town's medieval boundaries. The worst slum areas were the Rookeries between Market Square and Parliament Street, and the former marshlands of Broad Marsh and Narrow Marsh. The slums of Nottingham had the lowest recorded life expectancy in the entirety of the British Empire, and were described by contemporaries as second only to Bombay. Where the Broad Marsh shopping centre now stands was once one of the worst slums in the world. Life expectancy was between 14 and 18, and around 45% of children died before the age of 4. Sir Richard Phillips visited Broad Marsh in 1829 and wrote, "There being many families, and even extra lodgers in all, it swarmed with population. Maggots in carrion flesh, or mites in cheese, could not be huddled more closely together. Everything bespoke hard work and inadequate pay." The terrible conditions inspired the Luddites, the machine smashers who became a national crisis. The government made machine smashing a capital offence and deployed the army to protect the machines owned by the wealthy. Lord Byron sympathised with the Luddites and spoke in their defence in the House of Lords. "During the short time I recently passed in Notts, not 12 hours elapsed without some fresh act of violence. These outrages have arisen from circumstances of the most unparalleled distress. I have traversed the seat of war in the peninsula. I have been in some of the most oppressed provinces of Turkey, but never, under the most despotic of governments, did I behold such squalid wretchedness as I have seen since my return, in the very heart of a Christian country." It is difficult for us, living in modern Nottingham, walking around modern Broad Marsh, to conceive of how bad living conditions were at that time. It was a time before rubbish collections, before bin bags. It was a time before the town had a proper sewage system, with waste just flowing down open sewers in the streets. It was a time before houses came with their own toilets, or their own taps. In the slums, one toilet was shared between 3 or 4 houses. Diseases spread quickly. Cholera outbreaks were frequent. In the 1830s, when these diseases started affecting rich people through their servants, the government took notice, setting up public inquiries into the sanitary conditions of the working poor. The Health of Towns Commission report from 1845 is full of visceral and evocative descriptions of the Nottingham slums. Nowhere else shall we find so large a mass of inhabitants crowded into courts, alleys, and lanes as in Nottingham, and those, too, of the worst possible construction. Here they are clustered upon each other, court within court, yard within yard, lane within lane, in a manner to defy description. The streets are very generally narrow, unpaved, uneven, ill-ventilated, noisome, and damp. The refuse matter is allowed to accumulate until, by its mass and its advanced putrefaction, it has acquired value of manure, and thus it is sold and carted away by the muck majors. The younger members of families are driven into the streets, and thus girls and youths, destitute of adequate house room and freed from parental control, become accustomed to gross immoralities. Rooms of only 11 feet square contain families of 4, 5, and 6 individuals. The consequences of this overcrowding of small rooms is the engendering of disease and death. Our tables of mortality show the amount of death, but they do not tell us the misery and poverty those deaths leave behind. In Nottingham, these scenes of misery are enormously aggravated by the horribly prevailing habit of giving opium to produce infanticide. Owing to the hard labour and reduced wages of the working classes, the mothers are unable to nurse or take care of their infants. Therefore, to keep them quiet, opiates are given, and the doses are increased till life has passed away. If to all these circumstances we add the crevices of the rooms swarming with vermin, we shall arrive at some approach to a just conception of the miserable condition of the habitations I have here attempted to describe. The description must, however, still fall greatly short of reality. These quarters, and the population huddled within them, must be seen to be thoroughly understood. Chapter 7. The Cowocracy. Now, you may be wondering, why didn't they just build here, or here, or here, or here? These fields and meadows to the north and south were common land. The land to the west was part of the castle grounds, owned by the Duke of Newcastle. The land to the east was owned by the Musters family of Collock Hall. To be fair to the Duke, he was willing to do his bit to allay the housing crisis by converting the castle park into an exclusive private estate for Nottingham's wealthy, who had been fleeing to the nearby villages. The Musters were happy to keep their land house free. So that left the fields and the meadows. There were calls for enclosure as soon as the town started to get cramped, but it was consistently blocked by the Nottingham Corporation, the town council. A local history article published in 1955 describes this period of Nottingham's history as a cowocracy. Let's stop there and just pretend that the town was allowed to become one of the worst slums in the world because sentient cows had hypnotised the corporation members into protecting their grazing ground at all human costs. You could get a Doctor Who episode out of that.
This is our land, Doctor, and it shall not be enclosed.
You're not serious?
Unfortunately, the truth is less exciting. The commoners of Nottingham resisted enclosure for as long as possible. The town's rural migrants have brought with them tales of the horrors of enclosure, feeling they'd been conned out of their commons rights, left landless, and with no option but to accept pittance wages or starve. So, perhaps quite naturally, the commoners of Nottingham, who had become a privileged minority due to the town's growth, were unwilling to enclose the land and give up their rights. Why did they have to lose their rights, when the Duke could be building working-class housing on his land, not just massive houses for the wealthy? Why did the commoners have to lose out, while the aristocrats got to keep all their land and wealth? If the commoners wouldn't agree to it, the only way the land could be enclosed was if the Nottingham Corporation asked Parliament to forcibly enclose the land with an Enclosure Act. The cowocracy was, according to that 1955 article, an unholy alliance of cowkeepers and slum owners who controlled the corporation and blocked any attempts to expand the town onto the commons, letting Nottingham become one of the worst slums in the world in order to protect commons rights and landlords' profits. Eventually, in 1835, the government of Earl Grey passed the Municipal Reform Act, which reformed local elections. At the next local election, the cowocracy was defeated, and in 1845 the Nottingham Enclosure Act passed through Parliament. Over the next 20 years, enclosure commissioners divided up the common land and allocated it to landlords. In 1865, enclosure was complete, and the town could begin expanding outwards. It was the beginning of modern Nottingham. Chapter 8. Legacies. This era of slums obviously had a huge impact on the city that developed in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th. The delayed enclosure prevented Nottingham from expanding at the same time as other industrial cities. Their early industrial sprawls became their large city centres of today. By the time Nottingham expanded, the trend in town planning had shifted towards suburbanisation. Today, almost as soon as you leave Nottingham's old medieval town boundaries, you leave the city centre and enter the suburbs. The reformed Nottingham Corporation was more socially conscious than the cowocracy it had replaced, and so felt great shame about the slums. Having witnessed such a colossal failure of the private sector to provide quality housing that put people first, the city became one of the biggest and fastest builders of council housing in the country, a tradition it continues to this day through Nottingham City Homes. After enclosure, there was room for Nottingham industries to expand, to build factories. Job prospects and living standards increased. Hosiery changed from a cottage to a factory industry, and Nottingham became one of the world's largest producers of hosiery.
The actual manufacturing of hosiery was later outsourced, but many hosiery companies still have their headquarters in Nottingham. If you've ever purchased socks in Britain, chances are they're imported by a company based in Nottingham.
The city did its best to pretend the slums never existed, clearing them and relocating the inhabitants to new houses built on the enclosed land. All working-class houses from the slums eras were demolished, all evidence of their existence minimised. The rookeries were replaced by the grand Victorian buildings of Long Row and King and Queen Street. The name Narrow Marsh was wiped from Nottingham maps, the slums replaced by this new housing estate. And what of Broad Marsh? MAGNUS, MARISCUS.
MAGNUS, MARISCUS.
Obviously it became a shopping centre. This shopping centre. This imposing, unwelcoming fortress. What were they thinking?
We'll find out next time!
Drury Hill.
Ashes. You have my permission to die.
Thanks for watching.